deficient in some way. And I learned in the combat rap group that post-traumatic stress is a normal reaction to an event that is not in the normal human experience.
Sure.
Certainly combat falls into that, but anybody who's been the victim of sexual abuse falls into that. Anybody who's been the victim of physical domestic violence will fall into that category. And another thing that is commonly misunderstood is that everybody is different. Which seems obvious, but like I think you were saying in the introduction, that the onset of post-traumatic stress started at the age of 23. Well, with Vietnam vets, that was the truth. However, if somebody doesn't go into war zone or doesn't go through a serious trauma until they're, say, 38 years old, well, that may manifest itself immediately or later. One of the things that they were trying to figure out with Vietnam veterans is why the incidences of post-traumatic stress disorders seem to be so much higher. And they came up with three things. Number one, it was the age. It had to do with age. The average age of a Vietnam veteran was 19 years old when they were experiencing combat. The second thing was that unlike World War II and the Korean War, veterans went over as individuals, not as a group, and they returned as individuals. So there wasn't the time to debrief and kind of decompress with others that had similar experiences. And the last thing was the fact that Vietnam vets were not treated very well when they returned. So those were three things that did that, but there's so many other factors. I know that from what I know personally and from what I've read, that the incidences of post-traumatic stress disorder in returning Iraq and Afghan vets is even higher than it was for Vietnam vets. And this is my own postulation, but I've wondered why that is, because the average age for Iraqi and Afghani vets is older than 19. I think it's around 23. I don't know that for sure, but I know it's older than 19. But I think some of that actually has to do with technology, that, they could go out on a mission or on a patrol in the day and then come back to their compound and sit down at a computer and call home if they wanted to or had the privilege to do that. I think I would have lost my mind in Vietnam if I'd had that, because the alienation that one feels is enormous. In Vietnam, I used to have people write and, ask me, how's it going, and so on, and how are you, and, absolutely well-intentioned and sweet. But that the words themselves actually increased my feelings of isolation, because you couldn't write home and say, well, we're sitting here waiting to be overrun, and it really sucks. And I don't want to die, and I'm not sure even why I'm here. So rather than writing some BS home, I just chose not to write at all. In fact, I haven't written a letter since Vietnam. Written some emails, but actually haven't written a letter. I would imagine the same thing is true for those veterans that are coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq. One of the other common misconceptions with people with PTSD, or challenges maybe is a better way to put it, is that we tend to judge our experiences compared to other people. When I was in Nam, Khe Sanh was probably one of the worst battles ever, and I lost a dear friend in Khe Sanh. But those people were taking literally thousands of incoming rounds a day. Well, I was just waiting to be overrun, which psychologically was messed up, but I wasn't taking thousands of rounds a day. So I always diminished and minimized my combat experience. And then for people that were not, let's say that they were, I don't know, on an Air Force base down in the south part of Vietnam that was fortunate enough to not actually have to experience that kind of combat. I used to look down on those people thinking, well, they didn't have to go through what I went through. And I learned that actual exposure to combat wasn't even necessary to have a severe case of post-traumatic stress disorder. Specific example was corpsmen in Vietnam. I'm not sure what the setup is in Afghanistan and Iraq, but in Vietnam, medical ships used to be out in Da Nang Bay, and that's where I was. I was in I Corps, or the northern part of South Vietnam, which is where the Marines were. And one of the things that they discovered is that post-traumatic stress disorder, or post-traumatic stress among medics and corpsmen, was the worst of all, because it has to do with the loss of control. In a war zone, you really have no control, or very little. You don't know, especially in a guerrilla war, you don't know when you're going to be shot at. You don't know who is your enemy and who is your friend. And it's the same thing for somebody who's a victim of sexual abuse or rape, or a woman who's being battered, is a loss of control. So control is a big issue. So here I would have been at one time judging a corpsman who was on a hospital ship, eating 3 hots a day and having a shower and everything else, and thinking, well, how could they possibly have post-traumatic stress disorder, because they didn't see anything? Well, they did see something, and they saw war. So that was something else that I learned. And in one of my and I was actually fortunate enough, after going through 2 combat rap groups, the second one I chose to go through, to co-facilitate some combat rap groups. And one of the things I discovered is in one of these rap groups, we had a World War II veteran, a D-Day veteran who was in the group. And his experiences and his emotions and what he had dealt with were just almost exactly the same as what Vietnam veterans were dealing with, which is why PTSD has been around. It's even, I think Caesar wrote about it, and I forget the words he used, but in the Civil War, it was called soldier's heart. And in World War I, it was called shell shock. In World War II, it was called combat fatigue or battle fatigue. And that was the term that's still being used. So the effects of war on the individual have been the same forever, because most people, I mean, I don't think it's 100% of everything, but, we're not built for war. It's one thing to see it on TV. It's something else to see, somebody get shot in the head in front of you, or to come across a body that's been burned to a crisp, the smells and everything. So what the person does that is in that situation where there is no control over the horror, where there's a threat of death or imminent death or physical harm or bodily harm, is to shut down, to literally stop feeling as much as possible, because it's the only way to survive. The challenge is that when the person returns to a quote-unquote normal environment, is they aren't even aware of the shutting down because it's so subtle, number one, but how to actually reopen themselves again to feeling, which is why probably the most common symptomology of somebody that suffers from PTSD is emotional distance in isolation, the fear of being vulnerable. And what's most frustrating, I'm sure, for family members is that where PTSD seems to be most pronounced at times with isolation, emotional isolation I'm talking about, is with the people that we are closest to. Our family members, our children, our spouse, our family, because that's where we are the most vulnerable. And where we are the most vulnerable is where we have the greatest risk of loss and the greatest fear of loss. And these aren't conscious things. These are just some of the things that I learned about post-traumatic stress disorder. So that's kind of a broad view. One other story I wanted to share about, in terms of judging my own experience in Vietnam. I was in communication, and we had radio vans, and we had to set up our antennas. And so the people that were out, humping a radio on their back on patrol, if they needed to call in artillery or call in an airstrike, they would use their radio, and it would send a signal to our antennas, and then our antenna would send it to another antenna until it arrived at its destination, whether it was at a ship or whatever. And the Viet Cong used to use our antennas as guidons for their mortars. So we always had to build two bunkers, one for our radio and then one for incoming. But when I used to think about, again, caisson or other, somebody that was a forward observer or somebody who was on reconnaissance, it just seemed much more dangerous to me. I felt very lucky. And in one of my combat rep groups, I had a good friend who was what we called tunnel rats. And the tunnel rat's job, it was an infantry position, is the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese built miles of underground tunnels. In some cases actually had regimental headquarters dug in underground. But the tunnel rat's job was to be the first one into the tunnel, and there was no way of knowing what you were going to find in that. It was a very, very dangerous, scary thing to do. And so in my group, I told him, I said, I couldn't do what you did. I have so much admiration for your courage, and I'm paraphrasing. And he said, well, I couldn't do what you did. And I said, what do you mean? You were exposed to far more danger. He said, yeah, but I could run. He said, you couldn't run. You were a sitting target. And I never once thought about myself as a sitting target. I'd always put my experience as being less than this other individual's. And that's fairly common. It's common with battered women. Well, he's only hit me once, or it's only happened a couple times, and this other person has had it happen many more times. So my experience isn't really worthy of having some kind of stress reaction. Maybe one of the ways to think about post-traumatic stress, and this was helpful to me, because the length of exposure to the danger, to the threat to one's body, the length of time that a person is exposed definitely does contribute to the severity of post-traumatic stress disorder. Now I lost my train of thought. So ask me a question quick, and I will get it back, and I apologize.
Okay. It's okay. So would you say that your tour in Nam was the main cause of the PTSD, or is it all of your traumatic experiences together, if you look back on it now that you understand what PTSD is?
Well, it's that's why it's so individual. It definitely is a cumulative experience. Because I went to the Vietnam Vet Center, or the Vet Center, shortly after, within a couple of years after I lost my wife and son and sister, I was able to process that grief at the same time, because I didn't really understand that I didn't think I had any issues with Vietnam necessarily, because I wasn't aware of how it was actually influencing my life. One of the most frustrating things for me as a veteran and being in groups and co-facilitating groups is that many, many vets, and I'm sure this goes across the board for other people that are suffered traumatic experiences, think that if you get counseling for post-traumatic stress, that somehow it means that you're insane. Which it absolutely doesn't. In fact, it kind of means the exact opposite. It's a normal response.
Sure.
So most people that walk around with PTSD never seek help, because they don't actually believe that they need help, and that's a very very frustrating experience, because you want to reach out to them and say, this actually does help. Now, in terms of the way that the groups helped me the most is that I was able to finally recognize some of my reactions to different stimuli, like traffic jams, or being stuck in traffic. It just makes me want to scream, just drives me up a wall, and I just thought, well, that's just me because I'm being impatient. And it wasn't for years and years after